Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 20th of November, and this video is important because we're looking at several frontline developments, beginning with Andriivka. We'll move further north to Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and finish off with Kursk. We'll also look at some of the most notable missile and airstrikes conducted by both sides over the past 2 days, because we really have seen intensification of both sides as a result of some policy changes in the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. But first, I want to begin by looking at these frontline updates. You can see just to the east of Orikhovo-Vasylivka, the Russian forces have started to advance after several weeks of a stagnant front line. You can see here as we zoom in, a Russian advance that amounts to 2.3 square kilometers. This is just to the west of Rozdolnia. We'll actually measure the distance over here. And according to Deep State, there was a Russian tactical success over here with an advance using a garrison amounting to an entire platoon. So really large-scale Russian gains, not really using as many armored vehicles. On a lot of these Russian assaults, they are relying on speed more so than protection, and that's why they're using lighter vehicles, sometimes ATVs, not really motorcycles as much. It's more preferable to utilize private vehicles or some buggies because it can carry more people. And so that's what's being utilized in a lot of these sort of like initial breakthroughs. And then afterwards, you have the larger platoon force moving in to solidify control. So the Russian forces are now making a push for Rozdolnia, which makes a lot of sense for two reasons. First of all, you have the Vasilivka positions to the south. So a Russian push here to the west would allow the Russians to cut off a key road that supplies Andriivka and then reaches all the way to the south to Vasilivka and the surrounding suburbs. So advancing along this key road would provide the Russians with a northern flank that would put enormous strain onto the city, because you already have the Russians putting pressure from the east and from the south. And so then the only flank which would, I suppose, largely be unaffected from the Ukrainian perspective would be the western flank, through which they receive supplies from Vermivka and more generally across the Mokriali River. And that's simply not sustainable. The issue with Vasilivka is that it's located on a really low elevated valley. It's also divided up into several segments and portions that could be very easily exploited by Russian attacks, armored columns, or just platoon-sized assaults, as we're seeing, that can push through open fields and areas that are not as well defended across a really broad front, as we're seeing the Russians really prepare for right now. And because the Ukrainian garrisons here are so segmented by the divisions of the river, they won't have the best sort of defense, both logistically speaking and then also elevation-wise. It's just going to be more difficult. So you have this Russian attack really beginning to manifest, and I think we'll see more about it tomorrow. And it's going to be the responsibility of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade to ensure that the Russians do not gain a foothold in Rozdolnia, not only because of Vasilivka, but also then because it would give the Russians this opportunity to cross over two lines of anti-tank ditches that were built. You can't really see them on the map, but they sort of pass through the Mokriali River and then stop around Rozdolnia. There's two layers of these that I really do have to export the KML file for. But in any case, afterwards, you have the same road going northwards and reaching several villages like Bakhatir and suburbs leading to Andriivka. And that's really concerning, because then the Russians would have a really good, unfiltered access to southern Andriivka, which already is not that well fortified, and they would do so along the key supply routes that are supposed to actually feed the Ukrainian garrison defending there. So that's a huge fear, that not only could the Russians advance through open fields towards Andriivka, but advance through paved roads that really should be the breadbaskets providing supplies to Andriivka. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. Now, to look a bit to the east, now we have actual advances that have been reported, and this amounts to 13.6 square kilometers of advances by the Russian side. Really is important, because a lot of this is just excess territory that the Ukrainians were barely holding on to, because the Russians hadn't put in the proper resources to clear it out, but the Ukrainians perhaps had a few squads and dugouts where they would stay that were really far away from their main center of gravity, either in Kurakhove or Spinivka, and then every single day they'd move in a crew of leopards or infantry fighting vehicles to just ensure that the Russians would not push closer. But now that status quo has sort of been upended, and the Ukrainians no longer had the means by which to defend in these areas, given how far away it really is from the center of gravity that I really talked about. You can see that the Russians are now from this east-west axis about, about 10 kilometers away from Usmanivka, and that's the entire width of this pocket, which includes Ilinka, Yelizavetivka, and those two villages are now coming under intense pressure. Some Russian sources talk about Russian gains and potential capture in Ilinka, which is preliminary. And you also have movement south of Yelizavetivka by the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade, which has allowed them to capture additional territory. And in this case, they actually did use very substantial armored columns. I saw footage from areas that had previously been geolocated as under Russian control, but still very close to the village itself. And now when it comes to these fields, these are very important because they acted as a buffer zone from the east to ensure that the Ukrainians would have more space to move around supplies and troops and more freedom of operation. So now the Russians are closing down on that and ensuring that the Ukrainians are pinned down in specific villages and really tightening the noose both to the east but also along the two really important pressure cookers, which would be the northern and southern entrances to the corridor, because you have this corridor, this very narrow corridor, which is so tentative at this point. It's just spanning 5 kilometers, and the Russians are putting enormous pressure on the remaining Ukrainians to leave this area. But the Ukrainians, of course, do want to extend their stay here for as long as possible. Mainly 79th Brigade, aided by 116th, 72nd Brigade, 31st, 33rd Brigades are also generally operating around here. I would say that there is several hundred, if not more, Ukrainian soldiers within here from those various brigades. Obviously, not the entirety of them staying in this particular area, but their routes to retreat day by day become more narrow and become more dangerous, but it is a risk they're willing to take because they would like to ensure that a lot of the Russian focus, which is coming from the 39th Brigade or 33rd Brigade to the east over here, really remains stuck in this area instead of then being shifted towards Andriivka, for instance, or all the attention being moved towards Kurakhove. That's the calculation that the Ukrainians are making. Now, in addition to that, it hasn't been able to stop the entirety of the Russian pressure on Kurakhove because northeast of Danya, the Russians have taken over another 2 square kilometers, really important advances through the very dense perimeter of trenches built by the Ukrainians ever since 2015. Now a lot of it is being picked off without much of a fight because the Ukrainians simply lack the cohesiveness and the manpower in certain areas to hold on to regions that are just so disconnected from the main focal points of Ukrainian defense. And when you're asking what are the main focal points at this point, that would be Western Kurakhove. This is an area that is extremely well built for defensive operations. I suppose the issue is if everything around it is not conducive for Ukrainian defense, then of course it loses its optimality, you could say. So you could see here that you have the power plants, various mechanical factories in the western central parts of Kurakhove. You have just massive apartment complexes. Also in the southern section, Pivdenie has really large several stories high buildings, really good concrete slabs for defense, as you've seen in a lot of these urban clusters that the Ukrainians have. And then the eastern part of Kurakhove, the Russians have already gotten control over most of it. Some Russian sources allege that they have 35% control over the town. And you can see here a geolocation confirming that there was a Russian advance by the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, Opolot units. It's a part of the 51st Army Corps, which is, of course, the DPR units. And they raise a flag here to indicate that they are at the separation point between the central and eastern parts of the city, which is divided by this riverbed. You can see it over here and it spans southwards. So now the Ukrainians are relying on that natural defense line. It's not even a trench dug into the ground, but just this natural low point in order to, provide some breathing space for their own side. And at the same time, you have mainly the defense being conducted by the 46th Air Assault Brigade. They're conducting grenade drop operations onto Russian troops that are going to and from the reservoir north and south. So they are using speedboats, a lot of these Russian soldiers trying to land on the coast in northern Kurakhove. So they're being targeted by the 46th Brigade. And that unit is also involved with targeting Russian columns and organization points, most notably School Number 3. That's the main organization area, staging ground for Russian soldiers. But in spite of all the pressure that the Ukrainians have been trying to put and the defensive ability that they've been trying to showcase, the Russians have been able to chip away at a large chunk of the city, although the most dense and the most difficult areas to clear out directly have still not been taken over by the Russians. At the same time, though, the Russians are continuing to advance to the north around Toretsk. So it's just a very slight advance. You can see it over here on the map. The Ukrainians are trying to set up this temporary line that runs through the rail line. You could see it over here, and then also sort of converges with the local gully, local ravine, whatever you call it. And you can see that in red. So that's sort of shaping up to be a Ukrainian fallback line. But of course, it's not very, very good for the long term, because if you look at it in isolation, of course, it could appear to be conducive for defense. But then you look to the west and you see that for the most part, the Ukrainians have actually left this pocket in this rectangle. And in Salients itself, which is supposed to supply this rectangle, there are large-scale Russian advances. They may be in control, actually, of almost all of the settlement at this point. So you don't have a lot of trenches. There's not a lot of defensive density here. So it really is Beretsky and the ravine to the north that are resisting. And now you have the Russians beginning to put pressure from the north on Vozisenko. So this is, again, a ploy by the Ukrainians to just buy as much time as possible for the forces that are located in western Kurakhove and east of Andriivka. Very, very important for them. So when it comes to Salients, there was a large-scale Ukrainian campaign to ensure that the fighting sort of was dragged out, and that the Russians would eventually really let their foot off the gas and reduce the pressure. But that has not come into fruition. In fact, the opposite happened here. The Russians gained 1 square kilometer in recent days. And you can see this geolocation here. I'm going to mark it. It's in the southern tip of Salients near the agricultural sector. It's of the Ukrainian FPV strikes targeting those warehouses, indicating Russian presence in those regions. And it really means that maybe only the western section of the village is in a gray zone. The rest of it is likely under Russian control by now. And they're going to have to spend a lot of time now, not a lot of time, but just the next couple of days solidifying control in this region, ensuring that they have a strong route through which to reach it, because you have a strong Russian base of operations located in Kremena Balka, Novodmitrivka, and now the goal is sort of broaden the salient that they advance through along this paved road into Salients, and that would be aided by getting control over these open fields, and then from there pushing deeper along the roads that the Russians have access to towards flanking Kurakhove, towards putting pressure on Andriivka. Those are the two immediate goals, and the Ukrainians have to really prepare for that quickly. That means bringing in all the reinforcements that they can. So you're seeing a lot of activity from the 37th Marine Brigade, for instance, which has now split its responsibilities between this region and also further south around the area near Uspenivka, for instance. You have elements of territorial defense units. What we don't know as much about is what's going on with the 59th Brigade, because they were rotated out like a month ago, and we haven't really heard anything from their battalions recently. So seeing them reintroduced, I believe, is important, even though it would be premature from their perspective. And then you also have the Presidential Brigade. One of their battalions is operating around here. But again, not a lot of publicly available information about their activities in recent weeks. To the north, though, you do have the support coming from the 35th Marine Brigade, so that's very important. Fresh units that are supposed to be, higher caliber based on their Marine status, and just, again, fresh troops, something that the Ukrainians in this garrison lacked for a while, because they'd been fighting so intensely since about, July, August, when the Russians advanced past the Vavcha River. So here you can see further Russian advances just to the west of Novo-Oleksivka. These are a bit small in scale, but they're based on geolocated footage that you can see over here. This is a video from the 11th National Guard Brigade. It's just FPV strikes onto Russian vehicles and soldiers located west of Novo-Oleksivka. And the 11th Brigade is interesting because it's split between Zaporozhye and Donetsk. It's one of the units that had its battalions moved over to here just to garner additional troops, and that's in addition to the 14th National Guard Regiment Brigade that's also operating around here, and I believe also the 35th National Guard Regiment. So you do have this core of National Guard units that are not a part of the AFU that have been sent in to help with the Pokrovsk direction. So the 11th Brigade, in their compilation, they claimed they had destroyed or damaged 14 tanks, 4 armored fighting vehicles, 4 BTRs, 3 BMPs, and then 10 armored vehicles, using FPVs mainly, but also artillery. And that's combined for both Zaporozhye and Donetsk, although I'd wager the majority of them would be in this sort of sector west of Salients, because this has become really the area of responsibility for some of the battalions of the brigade. This is largely because there haven't been as many units left to fill that void. 25th Air Assault Brigade, they are also operating around here, and they had a bit of a lull for a couple of weeks when it comes to their intensity of action. But now we're seeing footage of them targeting Russian outposts actually in the gray zones. Have to change the map just north of Orikhovo and Petrivka. So now their objective is to ensure the Russians don't close the gap and make it all the way to the populated areas located south of Pokrovsk. So they're also operating in this theater. When it comes to other Russian advances, they really are closing in on Pustinka. That is the natural objective because it's the final village in this cluster of settlements west of Salients that has acted as a fallback line for the Ukrainians. But the Russians really have sped past it relatively quickly, not allowing the Ukrainians enough time to reorganize their forces after losing a major city. So here you can see 2.7 square kilometers of Russian advance, and then the natural goal past Pustinka is Zhovte. In relation to Toretsk, we have a couple of geolocations indicating large-scale Russian advances. I want to show you guys first the Zabalka district, which really has been in flux originally with the Russian advance and the Ukrainians repelling them. Now the Russians are back, and this is based on the Ukrainians, their own videos, which have been geolocated. You can see here, this is from November 19th. It's a Ukrainian TikTok video of an FPV strike onto Russian positions in the southwestern corner of the Zabalka district. Usually, if the Russians were to advance, you'd expect this to be marginal and located in the eastern portions near the forested region. But these videos, they're on the total other edge of this populated district, which again, in more normal circumstances, when you look at the entire course of urban battles between Russia and Ukraine, would be fought over across a very drawn-out period of time. It wouldn't have been possible for Russian DRGs to infiltrate, I suppose, 1 kilometer through an urban district and make it all the way to the other side before being targeted by Ukrainian drones. But that is really indicative of a lack of Ukrainian full defensive depth and capacity in this particular area, even though they were able to conduct a localized counterattack, which was successful. In the end, in the grand totality of things, the Russians have now been able to push back once again, and at the very least, because I'm being conservative with my estimates, have been able to take over a large chunk of the southern portion, along with now chipping away at the eastern parts of Zabalka. And when it comes to what the Ukrainians have control over, it's probably just the northwestern section, which is supposed to be the buffer zone between the line of contact and these major landfills overlooking the entire battlefield. And then they have control over this other small district here, the secluded district, which includes another smaller landfill. So that's the rationale for the Ukrainians as to why they're holding on to those areas. And then you have this large gray zone, which is really a prime opportunity for the Russians to take advantage of, because you have here the Russian flank to the north along the highway, which is really, really threatening. And then you have the Russian push coming from the south, which could help consolidate around this eastern district of Zabalka. And to the north, here's what's very interesting. You have a video that is actually even, you could say, northern Toretsk at this point. It's a video from the Predator Police Brigade showing grenade drops killing a Russian soldier. So, of course, that shows that it's not anything solid for the Russian side. It was a very, preliminary gain in a certain sense. And that's why I'm not going to mark it as fully under Russian control. But you do have to acknowledge that there was a presence of Russian troops here, indicating that the Ukrainians were not able to hold on to a solid line of defense. It was breached at this certain area. And it's actually the most logical area that could be breached, because if you look at the line of contact, you have very, very fierce battles going on in this western section. This area is very dense when it comes to apartment buildings or duplexes, and pushing through is just a complete nightmare and very, very complicated. And then I suppose you can say that to the north over here, the density is less. There's less density here. It's private residential buildings, backyards, some forested regions like bushes and shrubbery in the backyards. So that's an area where you could actually have small groups pushing through and eventually saturating the line of defense and reaching an area that's deeper. And it wouldn't really feel like an urban setting that much. And you can't really do it as much with this region over here to the east, because the Ukrainians for a very long time now have really reinforced their defense here. A lot of their frontline troops are operating in these regions because they were the ones pushed out of the suburbs of Toretsk initially. But over here in northern Toretsk, there really hadn't been an anticipation of a Russian, deep breakthrough up until now. And so the same density and same preparation really wasn't allotted. So now it's too late, and you already have the Russians penetrating into this area. So the Ukrainians will probably look to, take advantage of the fact that the Russian corridor here is very, very narrow. It's like this narrow corridor coming all the way from the center of the city to the northern section along just a certain route that they push through. And the fact that the Russians can even maintain it is impressive, and indicates that the Ukrainians, even though they have some counterattacking capacity, aren't able to do it and achieve it to its fullest degree. And so now it's going to be a question of whether the Russians can really retain this, because the implications would be everything to the east would be under great threat, really great danger, and everything to the west would be a future logical target. Looking at Orikhovo-Vasylivka, this is an archival video from either September or October of this year, indicating a Russian advance of 0.9 square kilometers. So we'll just click on the video, and it's just 4 minutes long, indicating how Russian troops, they engaged in a large-scale artillery barrage and then actually dismounted forces in this really well-prepared Ukrainian trench. They were able to storm it, force the Ukrainians out, evacuate their own wounded, and it is just a marginal advance that the Russians conducted in order to have more favorable positions southeast of the village, so they haven't actually infiltrated into that many houses. But one of the key strongholds at the entrance to said village has now been under Russian control for an extended period of time, even though that village is really not one of Russia's main priorities. Looking at the Kharkiv front, we have a geolocation showing a Russian advance just south of Hlushkivka. This is important because it's the natural next step for the Russians to reach said village. So a video from the 205th Battalion of the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade has been released, indicating FPV strikes onto a group of Russian soldiers entering into a house that is very close to the Oskil River, and indicates that they cross through Kolesnikivka and along this rail line through a very dense forested area to reach houses. And the Ukrainians, they no longer had the ability to push them back from Kolesnikivka. Now the Russians are able to use this very solid, a base that is just east of the Oskil River to begin expanding in both directions. In particular to the north, that's what they're doing. That's in relation to Kupiansk, I believe, because you're going to see the Russians try to take over Hlushkivka and then push northwards towards what would be the southern suburbs of Kupiansk. Those areas have to, be systematically cut off and be targeted by the Russian side, because there are, a wide array of villages here, defenses that could be bypassed actually if they're not attacked directly from the east, but actually from the south in areas that have not been built up for such a defensive purpose. And there were actually paved routes really prepared for the Russians if they were to do so, both when it comes to the rail line and the windbreaks, or the specific highway pushing from Hlushkivka all the way north to Kiev-Sharivka and then to Podoli. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's a potential, sort of some flower situation where the flower blooms and can expand northwards for the Russian side. And it all started, the genesis of it is from the initial gains in Pischane. Now, to look at Kursk, there are a couple of things that are really important. First off, you have admission by Deep State that the Russian side has been able to advance northwest of Pogrebki, take over large open fields and really dense forestry. These regions have been capitalized on for months now, since August, by the Ukrainian side, to continue to push through with armored columns or just troops that really try to really undermine any sort of balance of the front line. That's really been their goal since the beginning. And over time, as the Russians sent in reinforcements and solidified the front line, that's become less and less realistic. And now one of the final areas where the Ukrainians had the opportunity to do so, which would be west of Pogrebki, sort of the lid has been closed on that. So now the Russians really are advancing on a broader front towards Pogrebki, although I still consider it to be a gray zone. A lot of Russian sources do say that it is under their full control. At the same time, you have a Russian advance located along this rail line. There's an accompanying road pushing southwards all the way to Malaya to the south, and it was repelled by the 95th Air Assault Brigade. There was a video released by them where they target the vehicles on the columns, showing how they eventually are abandoned and then destroyed retroactively by the Ukrainian side, and then how the soldiers of the 810th Brigade are targeted in the tree lines by the FPVs of this brigade, indicating that, again, the Russians are operating here. They do have the ability to push through with armored columns, but the 95th Brigade is still holding strong more generally in the Novaya Sorochina area, but I would still say that Pogrebki is in a gray zone. An area that is really, really ambiguous would be the region south of Volgovka and Kremyannoy, because you have here these large gullies, these large forested areas and open fields that, according to Russian sources, have been cut off to a certain degree. So that would include this forested region over here. Claims by Russian sources, which I believe are exaggerated, say that there are Ukrainian troops amounting to 400 to 600 operating in this theater, and that just seems preposterous to me. But of course, I could be wrong, because of how disconnected it is from the main nodes of defense for the Ukrainian side, like Malaya Luknaya, and then southwards like Sverdlikovo, Suja, etc. Because this area is just so threatening. It's such a huge danger and liability for anybody who's in here that any large amount of forces would be in grave danger of being cut off, having your supply routes cut off, and then being targeted and picked off individually. Now, Russian sources, some of them, and so I'm not going to say this is definitive, obviously, but they're saying that 250 Ukrainian troops tried to get out, to break out of this sort of encirclement that was forming in the salient, and that they were able to kill 180 and take 24 POW. So there definitely are, at the very least, several dozen Ukrainian troops in this area. We know this because of a video released by the Russian side of an FPV strike on a gathering of Ukrainian soldiers here near a road, and there were, I counted, like at least 30 Ukrainian soldiers just packed together, and that's very interesting to see them like that, packed together in a certain area. In addition, you had videos coming out of Russian soldiers executing 10 Ukrainian POWs, and the location hasn't been found yet, but it was probably in this area over here. So there definitely is a kernel of truth in the story, and that's why I'm really interested to see footage come out geolocated showing Russian pushes south of Kremyannoy. But the reason why the Ukrainians have been so steadfast in this area is because they want to ensure a large-scale buffer zone to prevent the Russians from them coming in with this punch from the west, and then that would be enough definitely to overwhelm the Ukrainian defense along this entire chain of villages all the way to Malaya Luknaya. Now, as a brief recap of some of the most notable strikes by the Russian and Ukrainian side, I want to look at this strike, this ATACMS strike, the first one that occurred onto Russian territory proper besides Crimea, because we know for the past year, the Ukrainians have been in several packages using ATACMS. I believe since the authorization that Biden gave in October of last year, which really increased the amount of ATACMS being used. I think there were like 8 waves of more than one ATACMS being launched from, MLRS systems. And so just to zoom in over here, you can see that it targeted the 1046th Material and Technical Support Center, and the ATACMS used, they each had about 1,000 grenade-sized bomblets that dispersed if they were to hit their target, of course. So the Russian side, they claimed that 6 were launched, 5 of them were intercepted by the S-400 or Pantsir systems that were defending the base, and that then one actually did successfully land on its target and did not cause any casualties. But in the footage, you can see really significant explosions, probably a lot of them being secondary, and you can see that definitely at least one of them did cause damage to the base. Apparently, it was producing 152 millimeter, 122 millimeter, and 125 millimeter shells for the Russian army, and then probably dispersing them towards the Kursk front, but more generally towards the entirety of the battlefield. So that's, of course, a very significant strike, and it's understandable why the Ukrainians go for that, as one of the main objectives would be to stymie the resupply efforts of the Russian side to ensure that they are neutered in their artillery advantage. And so when they are going to utilize the ATACMS, the very few that they have left, because according to the Times, they have 50 left, and now that they use 6, it could be even less than 50, they're going to be utilizing it probably on the sort of higher value targets. So you can see that this is 117 kilometers away from the line of contact between the border of Russia and Ukraine, so within that 300-kilometer range, and it's not in Kursk Oblast. So this really clarifies for us the fact that it's not just Kursk, and it's not even just certain next to Kursk. It's anything that could be tangentially related to Kursk, and at that point, is probably going to be allowed by the Biden administration for the Ukrainians to strike more generally areas within Bryansk, Kursk, Lipetsk, Voronezh, whatever it may be, utilizing the ATACMS, and then when it comes to the British and French side, utilizing the Storm Shadow or Scalp EG cruise missiles. And this is the thing, the Ukrainians, they might have an abundant amount of launchers for the ATACMS, but in the current quantities, they are definitely going to run out very quickly if they're going to continue using the same volume in each specific barrage. And so then the goal would be, if the pace and the volume continues at the same rates, at the very least, the strikes will have enough of a volume to overwhelm the Russian air defense systems and at least cause damage in the very few notable strikes that they end up embarking upon within this, I suppose, 2-month period. Because the Americans, their ATACMS, they are still trying to preserve hundreds of them for their own good, as they still try to produce the precision strike missiles that they're going to upgrade and then eventually phase out the ATACMS with. Also, of course, there's a list of many other countries that are waiting to receive ATACMS. There's many, many others that are on the list besides Ukraine. But in any case, here we can zoom in and see that the Ukrainians have also started to utilize the Storm Shadow missiles. In this case, it's actually pretty close range, and it was utilized against the sanatorium building, the eastern portion of the sanatorium building, I should say, in Marino, which is in Kursk Oblast. Let's actually measure the distance here because it is not that far away from the front line. Probably it's not going to be launched from Russian territory, obviously, but it is 24 kilometers away from the line of contact and 40 kilometers away from the border between Russia and Ukraine. So what's being reported, and again, a lot of it's unconfirmed as of now because we're not getting a lot of aftermath footage from the sites, is that there were 12 Storm Shadow missiles being utilized by the Ukrainian side in the videos that were released by Ukrainian drone, which of course observed everything. So it was interesting that it was able to penetrate their Russian airspace and then get a good observation vantage points of the entire strike. They were able to, I suppose, based on the video, at least hit 8 areas successfully over here, and it would mainly be in the eastern part of this compound. So that caused significant damage to several buildings. You can see the buildings. I'm going to hover them over with my mouse. This one, this one, this one, this one. And what's being alleged is that there was a Russian communication grouping over there. It was previously targeted by Ukrainian shelling on October 11th, and now it's being targeted once again. And they're using Storm Shadow missiles, so that's very high profile. And they're using them at a range which I suppose HIMARS could have been used for. So the fact that they're using that, it makes me wonder if the Ukrainians had an indication that there was some sort of high profile target in this region. Obviously, none of that could be confirmed because the Ukrainian side is already going out and saying that there may have been intelligence assets or command and control center, and then they're going to tie it into the North Korean story. But always have a healthy dose of skepticism with those allegations. But again, the Storm Shadow missile having a range of 250 kilometers and also a warhead weight of 450 kilograms will be able to penetrate into bunkers located underground, which is what some of the implications being made by the Ukrainian media suggest, that it wasn't just targeting an on-ground building, but something under. So the only thing that will be able to indicate that for us would be further elaboration. I can't really give my own view on it. Meanwhile, the Russians are continuing with their massive uptick in missile and drone strikes. You can see one of the most high-profile airstrikes that did not occur during a massive wave, but just one individual strike was on Shostka, which is within Sumy Oblast, pretty close to the front line. It's a really industrial city, especially the eastern portion of it, and was targeted by this just massive strike, which caused huge secondary explosions. You can see it over here. This is just the rough geolocation. I don't think that it's fully accurate, but the target was the Shostka impulse plant, which is supposed to, during the pre-war era, supposed to create electric detonators and detonating cords, explosive initiation devices, and those are really, really needed and critical for industrial grade explosions. It could also apparently create grenade launchers that the Ukrainians would then use for the front line. So it has a dual use. And that's probably why there were also huge secondary explosions when it was targeted. But besides that impulse plant, there's just a huge density of Ukrainian facilities here, which would be on the Russian radar that could be targeted in the future. So this is just one area where the Russians could intensify attacks. But more generally, they've been targeting energy infrastructure during these waves. And I do promise that over the coming weeks, we're going to keep an eye out for that. Also, of course, keep an eye out for whenever you have Tu-22s or Tu-95 strategic bombers in the air, as they were today. There were 7 Tu-95s in the air earlier today that were, just conducting drills, not anything over Ukraine, no sort of bombing run, but still important to note whenever they're airborne. And so that's all I have for today. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.